Welcome to Liesl's Artistic Studio. I am hoping to answer some questions today that I get asked fairly frequently about how to transfer an image, drawing, or outline onto your watercolor paper for easier painting. I have 4 of my personal favorite ways to demonstrate today, and they all work great. So hopefully one of these will be helpful and work for you. As most of you know, if you've watched many of my tutorials, I often provide pre-drawn, printable, traceable outlines in my Etsy shop just to help give you a bit of a jump start into your paintings, especially if you don't have the time to draw an outline for yourself or if you don't feel like that's a skill you've quite finished developing yet. But keep in mind, these transfer techniques can work for any image you want to try to paint, even a reference picture that you've taken or drawn yourself. So just to use as an example outline to show off these techniques for today, I will be using this pretty flower drawing from my Etsy shop that I just put out last week actually, and I used it on black watercolor paper. That was a super fun painting to try out, and I will show how I was able to transfer this image onto black paper as well as how it can be done on white. So my first way to transfer images is super easy and also doesn't cost anything. It's not expensive. There's no equipment or tools that are required at all. I used to use this method all of the time before I was able to acquire better tools, and it worked great. All you have to do is find a well-lit window in your house, put the image or outline on the window first, and then place your watercolor paper over the top of that, and you can see the drawing right through the watercolor paper, even though it's more heavy and thick. I think the only downside to this method is that your arms can get tired holding that up for a while, so if you need to, you can even tape your paper right onto the window in place, and then you can give your arms a break once in a while. But this is super easy, works really great, and doesn't cost anything. Now, if you get to a point that you'd like to take a step up from that, this method is going to be easier on your arms and is more convenient because it can be done anytime, anywhere. But another way to transfer or trace these images is by using a light table or a light box. This is probably the method that I use the very most and like the best, but out of the 4 ways I'm demonstrating today, this one is the most expensive. But this particular light box is very thin. It has a clip to hold the paper down as well as measuring tools all around the edges. It has different light colors as well as an adjustable brightness tool. This particular one is very light and thin and is also battery operated, so you can charge it and then unplug it and easily move it around to any area of the house that's comfortable and convenient. You can simply just place it on a table, or I've even had times where I've just sat on my couch and had it on my lap. This does tend to work better if the room is not too bright. The darker the room is, the better you tend to be able to see through the paper, but this really works great. And for me, it was well worth the money because I use this so often. In fact, probably almost on a daily basis. And just as a side note, I will put links to any of the items or products you see me using today in the description of the video if you're interested into looking into anything more. Okay, moving on to the third way to transfer images or outlines, and that is using some form of carbon or transfer paper. Now, this is not a method that I use as often, and I'll tell you why in just a minute, but it is another great option, and it is much less expensive than the light table. Now, there are many different kinds and types and brands of carbon paper. This particular one is actually graphite transfer paper rather than an ink type like you might see more often. I like the idea of the graphite paper because sometimes, depending on the ink type of carbon paper you use, occasionally it can smear or bleed when you begin painting as it gets wet. This has much less of a chance of that happening, and I also thought that this type would give me more of a chance at erasing the lines after creating them compared to the ink kind. Unfortunately, it didn't erase as well as I was hoping it would, but something I did like about this graphite paper compared to the ink type here, which I will also be testing out on the paper so you can see the difference a little bit. But this outline transfer turns out much lighter in value compared to the ink carbon paper. You can see here the difference between these two, and if you're like me with watercolor painting, I really don't want to have super dark or visible lines left when I'm done, so the lighter the drawing is, the better, but that's also just a matter of preference. Now, before we move on to my fourth favorite way to transfer an image, let's talk about how to do this on, say, black watercolor paper instead of white. Now, black paper is not going to be see-through, so the first two methods I showed you obviously wouldn't work. I actually did try using some graphite carbon type paper, thinking that that would transfer onto the black paper, but it turned out it was not as visible as I was hoping. However, with that being said, just last week when I put out this painting tutorial, someone mentioned to me that there is also such a thing as white carbon paper, which I personally didn't even know existed and had never tried out myself. But I'm sure white carbon paper would work really well on this black watercolor paper if you'd like to give that a try. But since at the time I didn't have white carbon paper and the graphite transfer paper wasn't working like I was hoping it would, I had to use a different method. Now, this technique also works really well, but I don't use it as often because if I'm painting on white paper, the light table or the window is just easier to transfer and is less work. But this is just what I needed when I was ready to paint on black watercolor paper. Basically, I created my own graphite transfer or carbon type paper by taking a pencil and coloring or shading the back side of the outline. Now, this is a softer pencil that I used here. I think it was a 6B, so it colored in really nice and dark and thick, but a regular number 2 pencil would work as well. Then after I colored in the back side of the page, I turned it over and placed it on top of the black watercolor paper, and then I just traced over the outline, and voila! You can see here how well it worked out. The lines were very visible, and they actually erased better than the store-bought graphite paper too. And I will point out that even though I just showed this on black watercolor paper, it also works just as well on white watercolor paper. I think the biggest thing for me that I don't like about this method is that it takes more time and a whole extra step to color the back of the page rather than just being able to trace it directly on the paper like when we use a light table or a window or even carbon/graphite paper. But like I said, with the black paper, this was the best way I was able to make it work. Now you can see how the traced on image using this method can erase off, and that is a benefit or a plus compared to, say, the store-bought brand of carbon paper. Well, I guess that's it for my 4 favorite and best different ways to transfer images, drawings, and outlines onto watercolor paper. Hopefully you found this helpful, and don't worry, we'll get back to painting again next week. But if you enjoyed this tutorial, make sure you subscribe if you haven't already so that I can continue to help you discover your artistic side.